Okay, in the Beit Yosef, we're up to here, B'chtivat Tamah. The Tur is just continuing from the beginning of the Siman, where he says, Mitzvah Tefillin Shichtov Arba Parshiyot She'en, and he tells us the Parshiyot, and then he starts to list various halachot that need to be followed when writing Tefillin. So one of them is this halacha that you have to write B'chtivat Tamah. So the Beit Yosef says B'chtivat Tamah b'perek HaKometz. This is in Menachot, Daf Lamed Daled Amud Aleph. There the Gemara quotes this pasuk Uchtav Tam K'tivat Tamah. That in Mitzvah Mezuzah, it says you have to write them. But the drasha is to break it into two words, to make it as if it said Uchtav Tam, that you have to write Tam, so you have to do a K'tivat Tamah. So we'll see later that Rashi explains here, he'll say in a moment. בפרק הבונה, Uchtav Tam, שיהיה כתיבת תם, שלא יכתוב א' עם עין וכולי, ופירש Rashi Tam. Rashi says, what does it mean to write Tam? Shalem Gilchatan. It has to be written whole according to its halacha. So this sugya in Perek HaBoneh, which we looked at briefly in a previous shiur, we will go into greater depth in a coming shiur. This sugya here deals quite a lot with Ot, and so we will come back to that. Right now we're going to move a little bit ahead into the next halacha. That the way it's phrased in the Tur, it says B'chtivat Tamah, you have to write with K'tivat Tamah, and he says Shehei kol ot v'ot mukaf gvil. Every letter, each and every letter, has to be surrounded by gvil. It has to be surrounded by the writing surface that you're writing on. We usually write on, of course, klaf. And the definitions of klaf and gvil and duxustus is something that the Tur will deal with a little bit later. But this is the introduction now to this basic idea of הקפת גויל. Shehei mukaf gvil, the Beit Yosef quotes the Gemara again from Perek HaKometz in Menachot. Kol ot she'ein gvil makif la me'arba ruchotea psula. Any letter that is not surrounded on in all four directions by gvil is pasul. Even though tefillin are only written on klaf and not on gvil. Nakat Rabbeinu lishma di'itmar b'Gemara. Rabbeinu, the Tur here, right, the author of the Tur, took the language that was said in Gemara. In other words, he's quoting the Gemara here when he says Mukaf Gvil, and he didn't say Mukaf Klaf. So he was drawing on the language of the Gemara, and the Beit Yosef points out, even though in the Gemara itself, Gabei Tefillin, Amrinan, when it's talking about Tefillin, which is the sugya here on Lamed Daled Amud Aleph, Amrinan, there the Gemara itself says, Lo nitzracha ela lahada amar Rav Yehuda. We only need it, over there means we only need to learn the Mishnah, and we will get to that a little bit later on this shiur. We only needed to learn this thing, this ma'amar of Rav Yehuda, Kol ot she'ein gvil makifla v'chulei. It's kol ot she'ein gvil makifla me'arba ruchotea psula. So the Gemara, what you see there is that the Gemara itself brings a proof that letters in tefillin which are written on cloth, have to be surrounded by blank space, we call it, right? But they use the term gvil, even though Rabbi Yehuda, ki amra legabe sefer Torah amra, even though Rabbi Yehuda, when he said his din, he was clearly speaking about a sefer Torah, which is written on gvil, mishum hachi nakat gvil, and that's why he took the language of gvil. But the implication is that just like in a sefer Torah, all the letters have to be completely surrounded by white space, we'll call it, blank space. Just like in the Sefer Torah, that's true. This is also going to be true for Tefillin and for Mezuzah. So the rest of the Beit Yosef we will come back to. For the moment, I want to switch over and look at the sugya in Masechet Menachot. So what we're going to be doing, we're going to not look at this sugya here on Lamed Daled Amud Aleph, because what's being discussed there is first discussed a few dapim earlier in the context of mezuzah. So let's look at the sugya that talks about this regarding mezuzah. It will also be applicable to Tefillin. It's also applicable to Sefer Torah and to Megillah, and in general, in Hilchot Stam. It's a very basic sugya. So here, I brought Talmud Bavli, excuse me, in Menachot, Daf Kafchet Amud Aleph. So there, this is a Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Shtei parshiyot shebimezuzah, makvot zu et zu, afilu ktav echad makvad. The two parshiyot that are in the mezuzah hold each other back, and even one writing holds them back. So, what does it mean holds them back? That you need to have both parshiyot of the mezuzah in order to have a kosher mezuzah. If you just wrote Shema and not Vayim Shemoah, or Vahayim Shemoah and not Shema, then the mezuzah is not a mezuzah, right? What you've written is not a mezuzah. It's ma'akev. It holds back the mitzvah. Similarly, Daled Parshiot, Arba Parshiot Shebetfilin, the 4 Parshiot of Tefillin, Makvin Zu et Zu, Afilu Katav Echad Makvan, even one writing holds them back. So what does this mean, Katav Echad? What is the one writing that can hold them back? So let's look at Rashi. Rashi explains, Shtei Parshiot Shebemezuzah, of course, the 2 Parshiot are Shema and Vahayim Shemoah. So, as we said, if you write Shema and not Vayim Shemoah, or vice versa, it's ma'akev the mezuzah, holds back the mitzvah of mezuzah from being completed. K'tav echad. So Rashi explains K'tav echad in the Mishnah. The hava amina, the assumption is that it's referring to ot achat, that one letter, afil K'tav echad makvan, even one letter, makvin zu et zu. Right? Even one letter holds back all the other letters. Tichtiv uchtavtam, ktivat tama ushleima. So here again we see the drasha of uchtavtam, and even though we'll see when we learn the sugya later on in Perek Aboneh and Shabbat, this particular example of ktivat tama is not brought there. But Rashi says this is the same underlying halacha, the same underlying notion that you need a ktivat tama v'shlema, you need a perfect and whole, or a complete and whole writing. With tefillin ktiv haraya, with tefillin in particular, right? Because that pasuk is talking about mezuzah, But what about tefillin? Because we see the parshat should be tefillin, also makin zu. There it says havaya. There's a language of havaya that it has to be. And this is darshaned out from the word ba'ayu. And this drasha of havaya, the Gemara says elsewhere in Gemara Megillah, the havayatan yehud, that they have to be in their existence, is the maybe a literal translation. We will discuss this drasha in a different shiur. Dalet parshiot shebit tefillin, and so he lists the 4 parshiot: Shema vayim Shema, Kadesh likol b'chor v'yakib yacha, shebit tzidam. All right, that Kadesh likol b'chor and v'yakib yacha, which is next to it. Right, those 2 parshiot come next to each other. In all of them, K'tiv ule Tosafot or ule zikaron be'ninecha. All of them have either the language, right? 3 of them, Shema, Vayim, Shema, and Kadesh. I'm sorry, Shema, Vayim, Shema, and Vayakiv Yacha all talk about Tosafot. And Parshat Kadesh talks about ule zikaron be'ninecha. And those are all references to what we call tefillin. So those are the 4 parshiot of tefillin. Someone asked me in the Hebrew shiur why Rashi brought them out of order, and I don't have an answer for that, except that maybe he was just picking up on what he had just said about mezuzah, which started with Shema Vayim Shema. So he's saying we also have in Tefillin Shema and Vayim Shema, but in addition we have 2 other parshiot. Okay, in any event, from the plain understanding of the Mishnah, according to Rashi, let's say for our purposes, if you're missing even 1 letter, in other words, not only if you're missing 1 parsha, but even if you're missing 1 letter, then it holds back the mitzvah. So the beginning of the sugya here, which is repeated regarding tefillin, on Daf Lamed Daled Amud Aleph, I'm going to do it from here regarding mezuzah. It's going to also be equally applicable to tefillin and to Sefer Torah. But I'm starting from here because this sugya, beginning here on Daf Chavtet Amud Aleph, for the next several dapim, is one of the most basic sugyot in Hilchot Stam. There's quite a lot to cover there, and we will be doing all of it eventually. So I'm going to take the moment now to do some parts of the beginning of the sugya. So here the Gemara quotes the Mishnah, Shtei parshiot shebimezuzah ma'akvot zu et zu. V'afil k'tav echad ma'akvan. Right, so as we saw in the Mishnah, the 2 parshiot in the mezuzah, Shema and Hayim Shema, hold each other back. You have to write both of them. And even 1 writing, even according to Rashi, even 1 letter holds them back, right? So it's a kol shekain. If I could have started from here, right? In other words, if 1 letter is missing, then all the more so if any parsha is missing. But this is the way the Mishnah is worded. So the Gemara, though, right away asks this question. It says, Pshita. This is pashut. This is simple. It is obvious. In other words, this language that even 1 ktav holds the mezuzah back from being a completed mitzvah, that's obvious. So why is that obvious? So Rashi, following on what he said in the Mishnah, says, Pshita da'ot achat ma'akvatan. It's obvious that 1 letter holds them back. Dichtiv, again, uchtav tam, k'tivat tama. And Rashi explained, k'tivat tama includes the idea of shlema, that it has to be complete. So obviously, if you're missing 1 letter, it's not complete. So Rashi here is assuming that the Gemara already knew the drasha, right, from the Braita in Perek HaBoner, K'tav Tam K'tivat Tama, And so it's saying, I don't need the Mishnah to tell me that if it's missing a letter, if the mezuzah is missing a letter, that it's pasul. Obviously, it's going to be pasul because it's not whole. So what could the Mishnah possibly mean? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. So Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, Lo nitzucha ela lekotza shel yud. I don't need the Mishnah except to tell me about the thorn or the serif or the point sticking out on the yud. So what's the kotza shel yud, and what does it mean in this context? So Rashi explains, kotza shel yud, regel yemini shel yud, the right leg of the yud. So here I made a simple yud. I also gave it a little quotes on the top left, which I didn't necessarily have to do. But it has this leg here on the right. And so the way Rashi understands the Gemara is to say, at this point, that Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav is telling me I need the Mishnah to tell me that not only if I'm missing a letter, but katav echad, even if I'm missing one part of that letter, one part of the writing, namely the right leg, that it's also ma'akev. So the Gemara, though, doesn't like this answer. It says, v'hanami pshita. That's also obvious. So why is that obvious? Rashi says, hanami pshita, halo nase ta'ot. The letter isn't made. If you take away the right leg of the letter, basically you just have a nikuda, you just have meshichat akumus, you have like a little bit of a stroke from the pen, but it's not a letter. Nobody would think that that's a yud. We'll see about that in Tosafot, but for right now, we'll say if you take away the right leg, it's not a yud. So I'm back to the beginning. I mean, it's just as obvious as if I hadn't written the yud at all, because I don't have a proper tzurat ot. So it's as if it's not there. It's as if it's missing. It's not a k'tiva shleima. Ela l'chidach de Rav Yehuda Amar. Rather, I need the Mishnah to tell me v'afil k'tav echad makvan. What is the k'tav echad that it's talking about? I need it for this other thing, l'chidach, for this other that Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, not about kotzah shel yud, because that's obvious. But I need it for this. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, that Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, kol ot she'ein gvil mukafla me'arba ruchotea psula. Any letter that is not completely surrounded by gvil from its four sides, from its four directions around it, it's pasul. So how does this answer the question? The Gemara wants to know, what is this k'tav echad that's ma'akev that I wouldn't have known unless the Mishnah pointed it out? So until now, I keep thinking either it's a letter or it's an integral part of the letter, but the Gemara says, no, it's not the letter itself that's ma'akev. That's not the k'tav echad per se. The k'tav echad is that the letter has other dinim besides it being there, right, as being part of the parsha, and besides its surah. And in addition to having surat ot, it also has to be surrounded on all four sides by gvil. In other words, not touching any other letter, and not bleeding to the edge of the parchment, or not bleeding into a hole in the parchment. It has to be completely surrounded by actual gvil, or as we discussed earlier in the Beit Yosef, in the case of tefillin, it's going to be klaf. In the case of mezuzah, it could be klaf or duchsustus, and according to some Rishonim, it could also be gvil regarding the mezuzah. According to some Rishonim, you can write mezuzah on gvil. So let's see this in Rashi. She'ein gvil mukafla, any letter that's not surrounded by gvil. What does it mean? Rashi says, Shimud beket ba'ot acheret. The letter, if the letter is touching another letter, v'hainu diktani k'tab echad makvan, right? If the gvil is not around it, meaning that it's stuck, Rashi says, specifically to another letter. The other examples I gave of bleeding to the edge would also be included in this. Rashi's just talking right now about dihuk benot la'ot, right? So it's saying that any letter that's stuck to another letter, that's what it means when it said k'tab echad makvan, and to say it in other words, klomar, hilchot mishpat ot achat ma'akvol lemizuzah tefillin. The halachot of the laws of the law of the judgment, the law surrounding one letter holds it back from being kosher in a mezuzah or in tefillin. So what do we see? We understand that you can write both parshiot in the mezuzah, and you can write all of the letters, and you can have all of the Tzorot otiyot. Every letter was written properly, but if one letter is touching another letter, the fact that it's touching holds it back from being kosher. So that's the basic din of hakafat gvil, that the letter has to be completely surrounded by gvil or klaf, and it cannot be touching any other letter. So let's go on to the next part of the sugya. Amar Shiyan bar Nidbach mishmei de Rav Yehuda. So Shiyan bar Nidbach said in the name of Rav Yehuda, and by the way, just to keep track, remember Rav Yehuda was the person quoted here earlier. Rav Yehuda was speaking in the name of Rav. Now we have a Talmid of Rav Yehuda, Shiyan bar Nidbach, and he says this din in the name of Rav Yehuda. Nikev tocho shel hey. If the toch, the inside of the hay, was punctured, kasher, then that hay is kosher. Yirecho pasul. Right, so this is a shortened line, and it means nikev tocho shel yirecho, or nikev yirecho, I should say. If the yerech was punctured, then it's pasul, right? So he's saying two dinim in the letter hey. One is if the toch of the hay was punctured, if there was a hole put in it, the hay is still kosher. But if a hole was put in its yerech, literally its thigh, then that hay is pasul. So what's the toch and what's the yerech? So let's look at Rashi's understanding. Rashi understands tocho shel hay is regel shebifnim. The toch of the hay refers to the inside regel, the inside leg, and so that's this part here, where we normally, let's say in the k'tav that we do, in K'tav Beit Yosef or K'tav Ari, we make this look like a yud, an upside down yud that's on a slight slant. And I've made like a little gray area here. That's the nekev. So let's say, to begin with, there was a full nekudah here. There was a full stroke. And then, let's say the letter dried, and at some point, a hole got put in it. Maybe a worm ate through it. Maybe somebody stabbed it. So, Yikev tocho shei, right? And it's the inside part. So I still have this other little sliver here, which still functions as a nikudah for the hay. And so the Gemara says, Shiyan bar Nidbach says in the name of Rav Yehuda, that hay would still be kosher. Now, how big that sliver has to be is subject of some discussion in Rishonim, which we will get to at a later time. Yirecho, Rashi says, regel hayimanit. The yerech refers to the right leg. So in this understanding, if the regel hayimanit, if the right leg was punctured, in other words, there was a hole put in it, and then there was only a little bit of the yerech left, then that hay is pasul. So according to the illustrations that I've made, this hay would be kosher here, and this hay would be pasul. However, before we go on, Rashi has another understanding of tocho shel hay, and he says, Lamed Aleph Mishnah Chrina, another explanation, would be that the tocho is hagvil, the hachelek shebetocho, uvitfilin kamayri. He says it's the gvil and the open space that's inside of it. In other words, I still have the nekuda here on the left, and I still have a full leg on the right, but the inside of the hay was punctured, which is this gray area here. So according to that, nikev tocho shel hay is kosher, right? So even though the inside now is punctured, it's kosher. Now, why would the Gemara bring this here? So presumably this is following up to clarify something that we may have asked from the previous sugya. Previously, we said kol od she'ein gvil mukafla me arba ruchota, from its four directions around it, right? So it's mukaf, right? The letter has to be mukaf, and has to be surrounded on all sides. But it doesn't tell me what's the din if the ink of the letter is touching the edge of the cloth by way of a hole on the inside of the letter. So this is telling me, according to this second lashon of Rashi, that the inside of the letter, nikev tocho shel hay, is kasher, that this tzura is kasher, even though this part of the letter, or this part of the letter, I could have also made it touch the bottom of the top part of the hay. If those parts are not surrounded by white space, by a cloth or by gvil, they're still kosher. So according to this lashon, akafat gvil is only a problem for the outside of a letter, but not the inside of a letter. Let's read a little bit further in the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Zera, l'didim mefar shali minei derav Huna, Rabbi Yaakov Amar, l'didim mefar shali minei derav Yehuda. So they're going to bring another variation on this din. Just to explain the language, the Rabbi Zera says, this was explained to me, the Didim Shali, this was explained to me from Rav Huna. And Rabbi Yaakov says, this was explained to me from Rabbi Yehuda. And what was explained to them? Nikev tocho shel hay kasher, as we said earlier. Yirecho im nishtayer bo kashiur ot ktana kasher v'im lav pasul. So here there's a qualification that in the first iteration from Mashiach Bar Nidbach in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, he said stam, if the yerech, if the regel hayamanit, if the right leg of the hay was punctured, it's pasul, without qualification. But according to what the Gemara is saying now, there is a qualification, that if there's enough left of the yerech after the puncture, that it still has kashiur ot ktana, the size of a small letter, then it's kosher. But if not, if it doesn't even have the size of a small letter, it's pasul. So the Gemara here does not explain to us exactly what that means, and there again, there will be discussion about this in Rishonim, which we will get to not today, but eventually. But just briefly, Shiur Ot Ktana would be understood to mean the letter Yud, because that is the smallest letter. So if there would be enough here to make a Yud, then it would still be kosher. And it's argued that even if it's enough to make a small Yud, even though, let's say, a Yud that would go with this hey might be normally a larger letter, that it's a larger than this area here, but if it's enough to make a small Yud, it would still be kosher, but less than that, it's not kosher. We'll discuss that more definitively at a future time. But what we see from this are several things. So far we have, let's just summarize what we have. We understand that regarding hakafat gvil, that every letter has to be surrounded by empty space, and it is specifically not allowed to touch another letter. Another thing we see is that, according to the way, according to the way Rashi understands the Gemara in his second Lashon, the inside of the letter does not have to have hakafat gvil, that each part of the letter on the inside could bleed to the edge of a hole. Presumably, it's also true in the first Lashon, because here it just says Nikev Tochel Shahain. It refers to the Nikudah here, and right now this Nikudah is bleeding, right? This little sliver is touching on the inside of it, it is touching a hole, right? And it's not touching white space. And more, right? But when we come to the Regel HaYemanit, according to the first Lashon of the Gemara here, Yerecho Pasul, even though you could argue that now part of this you might say is on the outside, it's in Me'arba Ruchoteh, but the Psul, it's not clear why it's Pasul. Is it Pasul because it's no longer considered a Regel, or is it Pasul because it's no longer Mukaf Gvil? When we get to this part of the sugya, and we have this qualification, Mishtayer bo kashiur ot ktana kasher, so then presumably it's not a question of hakafat gvil, because there's a possibility that if you left enough, if there was enough left of the leg after it was punctured, it would still be considered kosher, even though arguably you might say that now it's not mukaf gvil me'arba ruchoteh. So this raises other questions, and one of the other questions is, maybe the din of hakafat gvil is only applicable at the time of writing. The example that's being brought here of nikev implies that it was punctured after it was already written. And so maybe you only have to have hakafat gvil at the time of writing, and if it's punctured later, maybe it's kosher. Now, for the moment, don't take any of what I'm saying as practical halacha, because there are many more details that we will have to cover. But this discussion here is going to serve as a basis for a lot of other subsequent discussion. A couple of other things that we understand is that there are certain elements that make the hay a hay, right? So basically when we make a hay, we're making a dalet and this yud. And so if it's missing part of the yud, it still could be kosher. If it's missing part of the regel, according to the second part of the Gemara that we learned, it could also still be kosher. here we have to be more explicit and say that it has to still have kishiur ot ktana. It still has to be big enough. There has to be enough left here to make a yud, even a small yud, perhaps. The other thing that we learned is, according to Rashi, that the basic tzurat ot of the yud is going to be, even though he doesn't spell out everything explicitly, but an integral part of the yud is going to be the right leg. That without the right leg, it's not going to be considered a yud at all. So let's look at the way Tosafot understood Kotza Shel Yud. Okay, so here, this is Tosafot. We're going to look at two sources. We're going to look at Tosafot on the same daf that we saw Rashi, and then we're going to look at the Rosh in his Halachot Ktanot on Hilchot Sefer Torah, where he discusses this issue regarding the Yud and also somewhat the Hey. So Tosafot says as follows: Kotza Shel Yud, right? So this, remember, the Gemara says that Fil Ktav Echad Nakvan, even when writing holds them back. And then at this stage, the Gemara says that means the quotes of the Yud. So Tosafot quotes Rashi, Piresh b'kuntras. Kuntras always refers to Rashi. The kuntras, Rashi explained regel yamini. Right? So I made another surah here of like a plain Yud that has a right leg. So Tosafot asks on Rashi, Kasha daha pshita dein za'ot. In other words, that's so pashut that the Gemara would not have even entertained that. It's so obvious that without the regel yamini, that's not a letter, that could not have, the Gemara would never have even entertained that as a possibility of what the Mishnah meant when it said Ktav Echad Ma'akvan. So Tosafot needs to find another aspect of the Tzurat Ot Yud, that if it's missing, I would still call it a Yud, but the Gemara is going to nonetheless say that it's Ma'akev. So that's what Rabbeinu Tam says. In the Faresh Rabbeinu Tam, Dehu Rosho Kafuf, the Kotzo Shel Yud, and Kotz, the literal meaning is a thorn, right? So he says this thorn of the Yud really refers to its bent head. So I've made a little tzura here based on Rabbeinu Tam's comment. Kedamrina b'samuch mibnei ma kafuf rosho. Like we'll say later on in the sugya, which we'll look at in a little bit. Why is the head of the Yud bent? So just to make a general comment here, if you have not yet studied some of the Gemaras that deal with Tzurat Od, there aren't Gemaras that are written out the way you may have learned the description of the letters in the Mishnah Brura or in the Keseta Sofer or any of the Achronim, where they try to describe all of the elements of the letters. It was a general assumption that everybody knew what the basic letter forms were. But what the Gemara does, sometimes very directly and sometimes by the way, is referred to elements in the letters. So that's what we saw when we were looking at the Gemara in Menachot. It says, Lo nitzach ha'el l'kotzo shel Yud. We only need the Mishnah to tell me something that the kotz of the Yud is ma'akev. So that tells me that the Gemara knew that one element of the letter form of the Yud had a kotz. The Gemara doesn't tell us what the kotz is, and thus we will have, as we see, a machloket between Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam, and even another daya brought by the Rosh about what the kotz of the Yud is. But nonetheless, what we understand is that there's a part of the Yud that the Gemara understood to be the Kotes, and it may have been an integral part of the letter, or may not have been an integral part of the letter, and it depends on now what we mean by integral part of the letter. So according to Rashi, according to everybody, the right leg of the Yud is an integral part of the letter, to the extent that if I took it away, I no longer have Surat Ot Yud at all. There is no Yud there. But Tosafot says if that's true, I don't need the Gemara to bring that case up, because everybody would know that's not a Yud if you take away the right leg. So as I said, introducing Rabbeinu Tam needs to point us to something, to another element of the Yud, that if I took it away, I would still recognize that this is a Yud. But the chidush of the Gemara is that in mezuzah and in tefillin and in Sefer Torah, if I take away this other element, that the Yud is pasul. So that's what he says is Rosho Kafuf. It's the bent head, and the coats of the Yud is the bottom left spitz, the bottom left pointy thing that's coming out. That's the Kotso Yud, because if I took that away, I would still have the basic stroke, and I would have the right leg. I would still know it's a Yud, but the Gemara would be coming to tell me that if I took away this element here on the bottom left, it would no longer be a kosher Yud. So this is introducing a very new idea that you can have a situation where you can recognize the letter that is supposed to be there. You can read that letter, but nonetheless, it may be missing an element which halakha demands for it to be there in order to be considered kosher in stam, in Sfarad Tefillin Mezuzot. So this is our first encounter with this concept. It is a concept that will come up many times in other places, right? But this is an archetypal example. So Mafarish Rabbeinu Tam Duhu Rosho Kafuf. This quotes Shel Yud that the Gemara is talking about, that if it's missing, it holds back the entire mezuzah. It's talking about the bent head of the Yud, which creates this coats on the bottom left. And how does Rabbeinu Tam know that the head of the Yud is bent in order to create this coats? Because we say it later on in the sugya, Mibnei ma kafuf rosho. Why is his head, why is the head of the Yud bent? V'im tomar. So Tosafot here brings a kasha on Rabbeinu Tam, right? They have to clarify something in order to support Rabbeinu Tam. They bring him a kasha. If you will say Damin b'Hagadat Chelek, if you say that we say in the Haggadot, the Agadah that's brought in Perek Chelek, which is Perek in Sanhedrin, where they quote a pasuk, V'na yichtevem, V'hainu Yud, Shi mishlich nar even bekir v'yoseh roshem oseh Yud, so I'm going to explain briefly what this is talking about. If you learn the Gemara there, right? So it's a long Agadah that talks about the attack of Sancheriv, or the attempted attack of Sancheriv on Yerushalayim when Chizkiah was king. And if you remember the story, Sancheriv prepares for attack. Chizkiah prays that he will be saved, that Yerushalayim will be saved, and Hashem hears his prayers, and he sends a plague into the troops of Sancheriv, and nearly all of them are wiped out and the rest of them run away. So the Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin is talking about that story. And there, one of the questions the Gemara asks is how many soldiers were left? And so one of the proof texts is to show that only 10 were left is from this pasuk, which I quoted down here, and from Yeshayahu Perek Yud Pasuk Yud Tet, where even though Yeshayahu here is using metaphorical language, he is in fact talking about the attack of Sanhedrin. And he says, Ushar Eitz Ya'aro Mispar Yiyu. He's calling the troops of Sancheriv the trees of his forest. So he says the other, or what remained of the trees of his forest of Sancheriv, what remained of his troops, Aspari, or what will remain, was just a few. Was a number. It was a small number. It was a small number. V'na'ar yichtavem. A child will write them. So the different interpretations in this, and one of the interpretations is what Tosafot says. What does it mean that a child will write them? And how? Because the Gemara there says we learned from this pasuk that it was 10. So how did they learn it was 10? Tosafot says she mishlich nar even bekir v'oseh roshem, that it means that if a child took a stone and threw it hard against the wall, it would make an impression on the wall, and that impression would look something like a yud, right? Because it would just be like this nikuda, right? It would be this blotch on the wall, and you could say that that's a yud, and that's the basis for how the Gemara knows that there were only 10 troops left out of all of the troops of Sancheriv. So what do you see from this Agadah? That if in the case where a child throws and makes this, niche, this knock in the wall, and it's really just like a roundish type impression, we learn from that it would be looked at as if it was a yud, and that's how we know that there were 10 troops left. So what we see is what? We see that you could have something that looks like a yud that doesn't have a right leg. And so if that's true, then I don't even need Rabbeinu Tam's Perush, because I could say, no, Rashi was right all along. That the Regel Yemini also falls into this category, that it's an element that I need halachically, but if it was removed, I would still know that there's a yud there, right? Because I have this example of the Yishlich Nar Even Bakir. So that's a kasha on Rabbeinu Tam. I don't need him to make his perush that it's referring to the left side, the bottom left side of the yud. I could just go with what Rashi said. It would be enough. So Tosafos answers for Rabbeinu Tam. Says V'yesh lomar de ke'ein yud ka'amar. That when it's talking about there in Sanhedrin, that Yishlich Nar Even Bakir V'yoseh Roshem, that it's talking about something that looks something like a yud, but lo yud mamash. Nobody would think that's a real yud. So it's enough of a yud in that context, in that very limited context, that if you looked at it and you would say Na'ich Tavim, it means that a kid could throw a stone against the wall and you could make this impression of saying, it's like a yud. It means that's the number that's being referred to in this pasuk in Yeshayahu, but there are only 10 troops left. Okay, so without belaboring that issue, we'll just summarize halachically. We see that according to Rashi, this would be a kosher yud, and if you took away the right leg, it would not be a kosher yud. According to Rabbeinu Tam, it's not enough to have a yud like this. You need to have kafuf rosh. You need to have it bent in so that you have another coat. So Tosafos here is simultaneously referring to this. So it's simultaneously referring to this tzura as a yud, simultaneously referring to the bottom left of it as a coats, which is why I try to bring it to a sharp point. And also that it's a reflection of this status of Rosh Kafuf. In other words, the way I got the point was by bending the head. Let's see how the Rosh understands this. So the Rosh says the Yud, right? So he's talking here about the letter Yud. Omer Rabbeinu Tam, Shesmol Kafuf Lamata Kazan. Right? So it brought the same picture of the Yud. Right? Rabbeinu Tam says it means that the left has to be bent like this. Kida Amar Beperka Kometz Rabba. It says in the Gemara that we just learned, Yinei Ma Rosha Shal Yud Kafuf. And I didn't learn this part of the Gemara yet, and I'm not going to have time to do it in this shiur, but we will do it next time. Tanya Nami Hatam. We learned it also there. Gabei Tefillin K'tav Echad Makvan. Right later on, as I mentioned in this, the Beit Yosef brought this same sugya of Kotso Shoyud and Kafan Kvil. It's also brought in the context of the discussion about Tefillin. So in both cases, the Parichale, the Gemara asks a kasha there, Pshita. Obviously, if the letter is missing, if the letter is, if one ktav is ma'akev, I'm sorry, if ktav echad ma'akvan, so the Gemara says, Pshita, obviously one ktav holds them back. The Ka'amar, and so the Gemara says, Lo mitzvah el k'd Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, kotzo sheyud ma'akev. Right, so this is a condensation of the Gemara that we saw, skipping a little bit of the part there, but it's saying that the K'tav Echad that's mentioned in the Mishnah, that's Ma'akev, that refers to the Kotzo Sheyud, the Piresh Rashi, Zel Regel Shel Yamin, Shekafuf Lamata. This is the Regel Yamin that is bent below. Now, notice that the Rosh changes the language a little bit from the way we saw Rashi, because Rashi just said Regel Yamini, and he says that it's the Regel Yamin that is bent below. And we'll come back to that a little bit later in the language of the Rosh. The Kasha Leperusha, but there's a Kasha in his explanation. The Pshita Demakev, obviously the right leg is going to hold it back. Dizehu Ikar Gufaot. This is an essential part of the body of the letter. Right? So he says that there was the Kotzo Shoyud is on the left side, and that it's bent downwards, as we saw earlier. Kidamashma Lishna, as the language implies, to Rosho Kafuf, that the head of the Yud is bent. Tzad Yamin Kari Raglo, that the right side is called its leg. So what he's saying here is that Tosafos is going to make the argument, he's understanding Tosafos to make the argument like this. Rosho Kafuf, the Rosh is going to refer to the left side of the stroke. That's the head of the letter. And the head is bent. And that's what yields the coats at the tip of the bent head. That's the Lishna of Rosho Kafuf. And it's unlike, and it's Dilatzad Yamin, you wouldn't call the right side Kafuf Rosho, because I already call the right side the leg. Because you could also say that it's bent in the back. I could just say it's bent in the back and not in the front. But that's the thing. I don't call that the head of the letter. I call that the leg of the letter. So that's to support Rabbeinu Tam's understanding. So now the Rosh brings another source, which is similar but not quite the same as our Gemara, from the Psikta. So this Psikta, this is where we'll stop. Next time, when we resume, we will go back to the Gemara in Masechet Menachot, and before we see the Psikta, we're going to see on the next Amud here on the Tet Amud Bet, we're going to see a discussion in the Gemara that begins here, Amar of Ashi. So I'll just read this first part here, and then we'll stop for now, and we'll pick up from here next time. We'll see the Gemara here, and then we'll go back and see the Psikta. Amar of Ashi, Chazina lehu l'safrei davkani devei Rav. I saw the exacting, like sofrim amedaktakim, the exacting sofrim, the very careful sofrim, who were in yeshiva of Rav. Dechatri lehu legage dechet, v'talu le lekrai dehen. When they made their chets, chatri lehu, they made them with a hutra or a chatoteret, and there also we discussed that in a different shiur. But they hung the kara of the hay. So what's the kara of the hay? That's going to be the nekuda smolit, but that's hung and it's not touching the top, doesn't touch the gag. So these were things that the careful sofrim were careful about. So why did they do it? Chatre luhu legage dechet, klomar chai hu baramo shel olam. But the chet, which is the first letter of the word chai, of living, it means that they did the chatre luhu legage dechet to say that he, in other words, Hashem, lives in the heights of the universe. And they hung the kara of the hay, the side of the hay, and that leads into the sugya that we're going to do next time. So this is where we will end. Anybody who has questions should please contact me directly, and have a Chodesh Tov.